In the narrow waters of the Strait of Hormuz, time itself becomes the central battlefield variable, collapsing under the weight of speed, density, and simultaneous threat saturation. What begins as a routine naval presence operation, designed around deterrence visibility and controlled escalation signaling, allegedly transforms into an 11-minute operational anomaly that redefines the assumed boundaries of maritime dominance. Multiple independent threat vectors emerge across distributed azimuths, compressing reaction windows to the edge of human command latency. In this environment, the defining question is no longer about firepower, but about whether decision cycles can survive contact with hypersonic timelines. Early fragmentary reports, combined with hypothetical modeling from modern naval warfare simulations, suggest a scenario where layered defense systems are forced into continuous prioritization failure, choosing between simultaneous inbound tracks faster than intercept allocation logic can stabilize. Yet the most unsettling dimension is not destruction itself, but sequencing. How an engagement space built on decades of naval doctrine collapses into near-instant saturation under conditions that traditional wargaming frameworks classified as low probability, high consequence. This is where the curiosity gap emerges sharply. If a fleet designed for multi-theater dominance can be functionally neutralized within minutes, then what exactly defines operational superiority in a hypersonic age? Analysts studying next-generation missile environments have long warned of decision compression thresholds, where human and machine coordination loses synchronization under extreme engagement velocity. But such models were often treated as theoretical boundaries rather than imminent realities. The narrative tension deepens further when considering whether the failure point lies in hardware, doctrine, or the mismatch between them, because each layer tells a different story of vulnerability. And yet, even within this compressed chaos, one question remains deliberately unresolved. Was this an unpredictable shock event, or the predictable outcome of a system that no longer matches the speed of the threats it was built to deter? At the center of this hypothetical escalation narrative stands the Fattah-2 system, framed not merely as a missile platform, but as a representation of a broader shift in how modern deterrence is being redefined through hypersonic dynamics, maneuverable re-entry profiles, and terminal phase unpredictability. In open-source defense discussions, systems described in this category are often associated with velocities beyond traditional ballistic interception envelopes, where Mach 10+, Mach 15+ terminal estimates are used as analytical benchmarks rather than confirmed operational constants, highlighting the uncertainty embedded in modern threat assessment itself. What makes this class of weapon strategically disruptive is not simply speed, but the combination of speed with controlled trajectory deviation in the final engagement phase, a feature that challenges the foundational assumption behind intercept logic. Predictability. Modern naval defense architectures like Aegis are built on continuous tracking, predictive modeling, and mid-course correction loops. Yet hypersonic glide or maneuver-capable re-entry profiles introduce variables that degrade solution stability under time compression. Research in contemporary aerospace defense literature increasingly focuses on what is called the intercept uncertainty envelope, a zone in which radar tracking may remain functional while fire control prediction loses reliability due to non-linear flight behavior. The curiosity gap emerges here. If a system can be seen but not accurately forecasted, does detection still equate to defense? In theoretical simulations conducted across multiple defense think tanks, layered interception against high-volume hypersonic salvos reveals a structural constraint. Processing bandwidth, not weapon lethality, becomes the limiting factor. The narrative tension deepens when considering salvo saturation, where even advanced interceptors face allocation conflicts between simultaneous inbound trajectories, forcing prioritization logic that may exceed human-in-the-loop decision thresholds. In this framing, the Fattah-2 is less a singular weapon and more a stress test for an entire doctrinal ecosystem built during an era when missile threats were assumed to follow predictable ballistic arcs. Additional complexity is introduced when factoring in global technology diffusion debates, where some analysts argue that advancements in propulsion materials, guidance miniaturization, and terminal maneuver algorithms are no longer isolated to a single development ecosystem, but are instead emerging across multiple state programs in parallel. This raises an uncomfortable question that remains deliberately unresolved within the narrative. Is the perceived breakthrough of hypersonic capability actually a singular leap, or simply the visible stage of a longer, distributed evolution that traditional intelligence frameworks failed to map in time? And if multiple actors are converging towards similar performance envelopes, then the strategic implication is not about one missile system, but about the normalization of a category of speed and unpredictability that fundamentally compresses the defensive horizon of modern naval power. Modern naval defense doctrine is built on the assumption that complexity can be managed through layers: radar detection, track refinement, fire control solutions, and interceptor allocation operating in synchronized cycles designed to neutralize incoming threats before terminal impact. Systems like Aegis, supported by SM-series interceptors, represent the peak of this layered philosophy, where multiple engagement channels are intended to create redundancy against fast-evolving aerial and ballistic threats. However, the saturation breakpoint theory introduces a critical constraint. Defensive systems do not fail only when they are outmatched, but when they are overloaded beyond their processing and allocation capacity. In high-density missile environments, particularly those involving simultaneous multi-azimuth trajectories, the system must prioritize threats in real time, effectively ranking survivability probabilities under extreme time compression. This is where modern defense literature introduces the concept of intercept queue collapse, a state in which incoming tracks exceed the system's ability to generate and execute optimized engagement solutions within the available reaction window. The curiosity gap becomes sharper when considering whether the limiting factor in such scenarios is missile effectiveness or computational prioritization speed, because even theoretically perfect interceptors are constrained by decision bandwidth. Research in naval wargaming simulations has repeatedly shown that when salvo size increases beyond a certain threshold, interception probability does not decline linearly but collapses non-linearly, creating a sudden failure cliff rather than gradual degradation. This behavior challenges long-held assumptions that incremental upgrades in radar resolution or interceptor speed can proportionally restore defensive reliability. Instead, it suggests a structural imbalance between offense and defense economics. Offensive systems scale through quantity and simultaneity, while defensive systems scale through complexity and cost. The deeper implication emerges when considering whether modern fleets are optimized for precision engagements against limited threats rather than massed, time-compressed salvos designed to exploit cognitive and computational bottlenecks. And within this uncertainty lies the unresolved tension of the scenario. If saturation, not penetration, is the true failure mechanism, then the question is no longer how advanced a defense system is, but how long it can remain functional before the mathematics of overload inevitably take over. Beyond the visible moment of missile engagement lies a deeper, more decisive layer of modern conflict: the invisible war of intelligence preparation, sensor fusion, and pre-strike targeting architecture. In contemporary military theory, this domain is defined by ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, systems that continuously compress the distance between observation and action. Satellite constellations, maritime patrol assets, electronic emissions tracking, and signal interception networks collectively form a persistent detection web, transforming the ocean into a continuously mapped battlespace rather than an open operating environment. Within this framework, the most critical advantage is not firepower, but time compression. The ability to shorten the kill chain from detection to engagement faster than an adversary can reposition, conceal, or disrupt. Modern research into network-centric warfare increasingly emphasizes the concept of pre-targeted geometry, where potential engagement zones are algorithmically modeled in advance using movement patterns, behavioral signatures, and environmental constraints, effectively reducing real-time uncertainty before the first shot is ever fired. The curiosity gap emerges here. If a battle space is statistically modeled before contact, how much of what appears to be reaction is actually execution of pre-computed outcomes? Additional complexity arises from electronic warfare and deception technologies, where emissions control, decoy deployment, and signal masking attempt to distort the sensor picture, creating ambiguity inside otherwise high-resolution tracking environments. However, even these countermeasures face a structural limitation. Modern ISR systems do not rely on a single data source, but on fused multi-domain inputs, meaning that no single layer of deception is sufficient to fully obscure operational reality. This raises a deeper analytical tension, whether the true contest in modern warfare has shifted from destruction of platforms to disruption of information coherence itself. In advanced simulations of hypersonic-era engagements, analysts frequently highlight a critical vulnerability. Once targeting data reaches sufficient fidelity, the engagement outcome becomes less dependent on battlefield improvisation and more on pre-established computational advantage. Yet what remains unresolved is whether this intelligence dominance is stable or fragile, because systems optimized for prediction can also be destabilized by unpredictability injected at scale. The question that lingers beneath the surface is therefore not simply who sees first, but who controls the interpretation of what is seen. And in a domain where milliseconds define survivability, even a slight distortion in perception can determine whether deterrence holds or collapses before the engagement fully begins. At the highest levels of modern military command, the most dangerous adversary is not necessarily the incoming threat itself, but the collapse of decision architecture under extreme time compression. In scenarios where engagement windows shrink to minutes, or even seconds in terminal phases, the traditional hierarchical model of command begins to fracture under cognitive load, procedural delay, and information overload. Naval doctrine is built around a layered authorization system designed to ensure accountability and precision, but that same structure introduces latency that becomes critical when the battle space evolves faster than communication cycles can stabilize. In advanced military psychology and operational research, this phenomenon is often described as decision lag divergence, where the speed of incoming data exceeds the speed of coordinated response, forcing partial, fragmented, or prematurely optimized decisions. The curiosity gap emerges sharply here. When does command authority transition from strategic control to reactive interpretation? Within this compressed timeline, even highly sophisticated command centers face a paradox. More data does not equal better decisions, but often produces slower ones as multiple parallel inputs compete for prioritization. Modern wargaming simulations exploring hypersonic engagement environments repeatedly highlight this vulnerability, showing that once reaction time falls below a critical threshold, decision-making shifts from structured evaluation to heuristic-based improvisation. This is where escalation risk intensifies, because improvisation under strategic pressure tends to amplify uncertainty rather than reduce it. Communication chains between field assets, regional command structures, and central authorities become strained not by distance, but by tempo, as each layer attempts to validate information that is already becoming outdated by the time it is confirmed. The deeper tension lies in the psychological dimension of command. Leaders are trained to maintain control under pressure, yet hypersonic speed engagement environments systematically erode the perception of control itself. At that point, command is no longer about directing outcomes, but attempting to interpret unfolding events faster than they stabilize into irreversible facts. The unresolved question becomes whether modern command systems are fundamentally designed for deterrence signaling in slow-moving crises rather than survival in ultra-compressed engagement windows where even the most refined protocols risk becoming obsolete before they are fully executed. When a single hypothetical engagement is framed as strategically decisive, its impact does not remain confined to the immediate theater. It propagates outward through alliance systems that are fundamentally built on perception, credibility, and the assumption of reliable escalation dominance. In modern security architecture, alliances such as NATO-style deterrence frameworks or Indo-Pacific security partnerships are not merely military arrangements, but confidence networks, where each member's strategic planning depends on the presumed survivability and effectiveness of the collective response structure. The curiosity gap emerges here. What happens when that perceived reliability is suddenly stress-tested in real time, even in a simulated or partial conflict narrative? Defense theory suggests that alliances do not collapse through single failures, but through cumulative reassessment events, where each new shock forces recalibration of risk models across multiple capitals simultaneously. In such an environment, strategic planners begin to reevaluate not only adversary capability, but also alliance responsiveness, reinforcement timelines, and the credibility of extended deterrence guarantees. This is where the concept of real-time strategic auditing becomes critical, an ongoing, decentralized reassessment process triggered by rapidly evolving threat perceptions rather than formal treaty changes. Research in alliance politics and deterrence theory highlights that credibility is inherently asymmetrical. It is far easier to erode than to rebuild because it is based on expectation rather than capability alone. The deeper tension arises when allies begin to internally simulate worst-case scenarios independently rather than relying on shared collective assessments, leading to divergence in strategic confidence levels across regions. Indo-Pacific security models, for example, heavily depend on rapid reinforcement assumptions, while European frameworks rely on integrated force interoperability, both of which are stress-tested differently under high-velocity conflict narratives. The curiosity gap intensifies further when considering whether alliance cohesion is primarily driven by shared capability or shared belief in capability, because those two variables can separate under informational pressure. As hypothetical shock events propagate through strategic communities, the real transformation does not occur on the battlefield, but inside planning rooms where long-standing assumptions are quietly rewritten without formal declaration. And the unresolved question remains deliberately open. In an era where perception travels faster than verification, can alliance credibility survive the speed at which strategic doubt is formed? In modern geopolitical systems, the Strait of Hormuz is not merely a geographic choke point, it functions as a real-time regulator of global economic stability, where even the perception of disruption can trigger cascading reactions across energy markets, shipping insurance frameworks, and macroeconomic forecasting models. In this hypothetical escalation narrative, the moment military tension intersects with maritime flow uncertainty, the global energy system behaves less like a stable supply chain and more like a sensitive neural network, where signals of risk propagate faster than physical cargo can move. The curiosity gap emerges immediately. If nearly a fifth of global oil transit routes pass through a single corridor, what happens when that corridor becomes a contested informational space rather than a purely physical one? Contemporary energy economics research highlights that oil pricing is increasingly governed not only by supply and demand fundamentals, but also by algorithmic sentiment models that integrate geopolitical risk indices in real time. This means that even ambiguous reports of naval engagement or disruption can generate disproportionate price volatility, as trading systems adjust exposure faster than human analysts can validate facts. Insurance premiums for maritime shipping, particularly in high-risk corridors, are similarly sensitive, often recalibrating within hours based on perceived threat levels rather than confirmed incidents. The deeper structural vulnerability lies in the fact that global energy distribution is optimized for efficiency, not resilience, creating a system where minimal friction can produce maximal financial amplification. In such a scenario, strategic uncertainty becomes an economic multiplier, affecting not just oil-importing states, but also energy-exporting economies whose fiscal stability depends on predictable pricing bands. The curiosity gap intensifies when considering whether modern markets are responding to actual physical disruption or to the acceleration of uncertainty itself, because in high-frequency trading environments, perception can become indistinguishable from reality in its immediate financial impact. Additional complexity arises from strategic petroleum reserves and emergency energy buffers, which are designed for physical shortages but are often deployed in response to psychological market shocks instead. This creates a paradox where systems intended to stabilize supply may instead amplify volatility when activated prematurely. The unresolved tension at the core of this section is therefore not whether the global energy system is strong or weak, but whether it is fundamentally synchronized with geopolitical reality, or merely reacting faster than it can understand what it is reacting to. At the heart of this narrative lies a deeper structural tension that extends beyond any single engagement: the collision between legacy naval doctrine and the emerging realities of hypersonic-era warfare. Traditional maritime power projection was built on principles of presence, deterrence through visibility, and layered force superiority, where carrier strike groups and destroyer screens function as mobile sovereign platforms capable of shaping regional stability through sustained forward deployment. However, modern threat evolution introduces a fundamentally different operating logic, one defined by extreme speed, distributed launch capability, and multi-vector saturation designed to compress defensive reaction cycles below doctrinal thresholds. The curiosity gap emerges here when the timeline of engagement shrinks below the threshold of meaningful tactical adjustment. Does naval dominance shift from physical control of sea lanes to control of detection, prediction, and disruption networks? Contemporary defense research increasingly highlights the concept of doctrinal lag, where institutional strategies remain anchored to the assumptions of previous conflict eras, even as adversaries optimize for entirely new engagement geometries. Hypersonic systems, whether ballistic glide hybrids or maneuverable re-entry vehicles, challenge the foundational predictability that naval air defense systems rely upon, forcing a reconsideration of interception not as a guaranteed outcome but as a probabilistic contest under extreme time compression. This creates a structural imbalance between offensive scalability and defensive adaptation cycles, since offensive systems can evolve asymmetrically and rapidly, while naval doctrine requires long procurement timelines, multi-layer validation, and fleet-wide integration before adaptation becomes operational. The deeper implication is not simply technological, but philosophical. Naval superiority has historically depended on the assumption that visibility equals vulnerability for the adversary, yet in a hypersonic environment, visibility may no longer provide sufficient time for response. The curiosity gap intensifies further when considering whether the true transformation is not the loss of naval power itself, but the loss of the temporal advantage that once made naval power decisive. In this framing, the doctrinal collision is not a single moment of failure, but a gradual erosion of alignment between threat velocity and institutional adaptation speed, and the unresolved question remains deliberately open. If every layer of maritime warfare, from detection to decision to engagement, is now subject to compression, then what does dominance mean in a domain where reaction itself may no longer fit within the window of survival? At the end of this escalating analytical arc, the conversation shifts away from events and into something far more consequential: interpretation. Because the real disruption in modern strategic systems is rarely the moment of impact itself, but the re-evaluation that follows it. Whether framed as a hypothetical scenario or a stress test narrative of hypersonic-era conflict, the underlying question is no longer about what happened, but about what the system believes is now possible. The curiosity gap emerges at its deepest point here. If deterrence is built on shared assumptions of dominance, predictability, and response credibility, what happens when those assumptions are no longer universally accepted across allies, adversaries, and markets simultaneously? Modern military theory increasingly converges with systems thinking, suggesting that power is not only measured in platforms or payloads, but in the stability of expectations across interconnected networks. Once those expectations fracture, every domain, military planning, economic forecasting, diplomatic alignment, begins to recompute risk independently, producing a fragmented global perception of reality. This is where the narrative leaves its most important unresolved tension, not whether any single system is superior, but whether any system can remain coherent when the speed of change exceeds the speed of institutional adaptation. Hypersonic-era discourse, network-centric warfare theory, and alliance credibility models all converge on a shared uncertainty. Whether the next era of conflict is defined by destruction or by the acceleration of uncertainty itself, to the point where clarity becomes strategically rare. The deeper implication extends beyond military systems into governance, economics, and global stability architecture, where decision-making increasingly operates under compressed timelines and incomplete information. In this environment, the true strategic advantage may no longer belong to the side with the most advanced weapons, but to the side that best understands uncertainty as a domain of power in itself. And so the final question is intentionally left open, not as a conclusion, but as a threshold. If the defining characteristic of this new era is not dominance, but velocity, of missiles, information, perception, and reaction, then who or what ultimately controls the speed at which reality itself is interpreted, and can any existing system survive when that speed becomes the battlefield itself?